For the fire saw, let's talk about self-serving bias and fundamental attribution error. In terms of your success or your failure, self-serving bias, if you were the one performing the skill, typically if you were successful, you're going to attribute that to internal strengths or attributes. If you failed, you tend to attribute that to something external, like this task was just really difficult, that's why I failed. Or the instructor didn't give very good instructions. That's self-serving bias. Anything that's positive, successful, you're going to attribute that to internal characteristics. Anything that's negative or failures, people tend to attribute to external variables. Then for fundamental attribution error, if you were not the person performing the skill or putting the kit together and you watch somebody else fail at it, typically fundamental attribution error, if somebody else fails within your group, you're going to attribute that to something internal about their character or about their ability. So that's what I want you to talk about in this video as you go through the fire saw. How do those two relate? If you're the person performing the skill, you're going to talk in terms of self-serving bias. Why were you successful? Why did you fail at putting the kit together? Whichever one happens. If you're watching somebody else, but you're going to make the video, then use fundamental attribution error. If they're successful, why did they succeed? If they failed, why do you think they failed? And is that connected to fundamental attribution error? All right, real quick, before we get too far into the video, let's talk about this skill itself. So you noticed on one example, I made a wedge and I used the fire saw in a different format than a traditional fire saw. So here I've already got my area made where the dust is going to form. I would tie this down, or your partner can hold it. And then I'm going to saw back and forth here. So this is not the traditional method of a fire saw, but it will work, especially if you don't have cordage. So instead of moving the fire board across the saw, I'm moving the saw across the fire board. I like this method because I can get in a nice comfortable position, and if I have cordage and I have a small fire board, I can tie it down to something. That's one way. The other way is hold it in a traditional manner, and then you would slide this up and down the wedge, the saw itself. So you would go back and forth and let the dust build up. That works too. But the problem is the saw, if it's too short, it's easier to use a shorter saw with this method because you can kind of brace it with your finger. But if it's too short and that's just not working for you, you can take the saw itself and tie it down to another thicker board that won't break. And then this would go near your stomach. This part right here would go near your feet, and then you would slide it back and forth like I showed you in the skill video. And I'll tie this on in just a second and show you how that would work. Whichever kit you prefer, put that together and talk about self-serving bias if you were the person putting it together. Talk about your successes, talk about your failures. If you're watching somebody else and you're making the video, then talk about their successes, and if they had any failures, link that to fundamental attribution error. Were you attributing their failure to internal attributes? If so, that would be fundamental attribution error. Here's the other variation of the actual saw being supported. This is something that you could prop between your stomach and your feet could pinch here. And just like you saw in the skill video, I could take the saw and then slide that back and forth in that area. The reason you would need something like this is to prevent this thin saw from breaking. So I need something to provide some support. So talk about making this in terms of self-serving bias. If you were the one putting it together, what were you successful at and what do you attribute to those successes? What did you fail at? Maybe you made a mistake along the way, and what do you attribute to that failure, trying to put the actual saw together so that the fireboard has something to slide across. In summary, go back over self-serving bias as it relates to your participation in the group. What did you succeed at, and what do you attribute to that success? What did you fail at? What do you attribute to that success? If you were a participant that was watching somebody else attempting a skill, make sure that you cover fundamental attribution error and talk in terms of why you think they failed. And did that connect to fundamental attribution error? Did you attribute their failures to something internal, something about their character, their ability, something that is not external but internal to the person attempting the skill? That would be fundamental attribution error, and that's by an observer. And then self-serving bias is you making observations about what you attribute to your success and to your failures. That's what I want you to summarize in your conclusion.